So now that we have this ring here, let's zoom in on this part where we also have some optimizing to do. And let's just take a look at it here, where we start. And I want to take these two vertex points and align them better here. Let's just take this one here individually and push it a bit more out there, and also a bit down here on the z-axis. So this point here could be individually moved a bit more towards the high poly, and let me just undo this here with this point. This looks about right. And then this point here, let's make it so that it actually shows up there. And now let's just make a connection here. And I'm gonna have two edges actually here with our connect dialog. This one here can be pushed back in a bit. And it's a lot about switching in between edge and vertex mode and just repositioning these vertex points or edges. Let's take this vertex and this one and connect it so that we tell 3D Max where the triangulation is supposed to be. And this one here, I also want to connect it. Let's take that point and push it out a bit, and same goes for this one here. And this edge here, we can just collapse it to save some poly count. And let's take a look here at the front. And I want to connect it. It's sometimes hard to see with the wireframe mode with the other mesh, the other edges, but I just made a connection there, and now I bring this vertex point a bit to the front. And also here, these two vertex points, just rearrange them, and I toggle with our wireframe mode, F3. Let's make a loop selection here on these edges. And then, since we don't want to get rid of the whole loop, we're using Alt. And also here on this edge, I'm going to use Alt as well. And then the rest of it, we can Control Backspace. And now this open edge here, we're just going to connect it. So that way we also saved some polys there. And let me zoom in here. This doesn't look good until we connected it here. And let's take a look at it here once more. I want to also connect these vertex points here, which in some areas is important to kind of tell 3D Max this is where I want the triangulation to be. If it's mostly flat parts, it doesn't matter, but especially at these borders or corners, it matters. So I'm gonna use the chamfer modifier here. I'm gonna have two divisions, and then take these vertex points and connect it. That way we have it nice and rounded there, and not just this low poly looking piece. So let's take another look here with our target weld at these edges, which are not doing anything. So we can just connect them over there. And the same here on that side. Sometimes 3D Max starts loading, so I have to wait. Because we have a pretty poly heavy scene here with our high poly in it. So as a next thing, what I want to do is only have our low poly in the scene so that we get an idea for the poly count. Let's bring up our Scene Explorer and hide the high poly just for the time being. And now we're gonna add symmetry back on. I'm gonna flip it here on the x-axis, add another symmetry modifier, and put it to the z-axis. So here we have this sphere, here we have these teeth, and now also with this band here, we have everything selected, and right now we are at 15K triangles. That's actually not so bad. I consider this a first-person weapon, but you could say that we can still do some more optimizing. I'm gonna delete the symmetry modifier, and basically let's carry on here with our optimizing. I want to focus here on this part. Let's go over to our vertex mode, and let's put our high poly back on. On a second thought, I'm gonna use our polygon mode here. I'm gonna select these faces here, these four, and then align it on the z-axis so that this is perfectly straight. If we look at it here from the side view, and I'm just gonna push it up a bit. So if this was a third-person game that we make this for, then I would aim to have like 8,000 polys. But since this is a first-person weapon, we can get away with more. But let's definitely optimize it a bit and see how we can bring that poly count down. Let's take these two vertex points here and align them on the y-axis so that this is also straight. And then we can push it here on the y. And that way we follow this high poly shape more as it was before. Let's take these vertex points that we have here from the top view, and I want to align it on the x-axis so that this is also a straight line pretty much. And I'm gonna push it down a bit here on the z and the x. And then I'm gonna target weld some of these points here so that we once again have it a bit more optimized. We don't really need these points. And now let's select these vertex points here, which can also use some better alignment here on the x-axis and then on the z-axis. And then we can position it here. So that way we have this element here really covered. Gonna just take this vertex point here, and I want to connect these two here, and then we can take this one and drag it over here a bit more to the side, as well as dragging it up here. And I want to add a color to this. I forgot to do that earlier. So I'm gonna bring up the material editor and add our green material to it. And this way we know that this should be also a different UV island later on. And in general, we just have a better division here. I'm gonna use a ring selection here on this part and collapse it. And now I want to collapse these edges here as well because they don't really do anything. So same goes for these here, but I'm gonna use our target weld for it. And this here can also be target welded, as well as this one here. So as the next thing, I want to focus on these horns. Let's get out of the vertex mode, zoom out here. If you press 7, you can toggle this statistic window here on the top left, this display. I'm just gonna hide it for now. And now let's select our horns. And you can see that they are not welded in there. So what I want to do is make a Boolean operation on it. And first of all, I want to position our pivot here. So once again, we press these tiny arrow buttons. And now we can just position it here on the y-axis so that it's centered pretty much. So with that here, I'm just going to delete these horns. We just want to focus on this one horn, and then we can just copy it on the other sides. Let me add another color to these horns. Let's select it and let's take a yellow. Let's assign it. And now you can see that we have it really just sticking in there, but it's not properly connected. So in order to fix that, we're gonna use our Pro Boolean once again, no edge removal. And then we wanna have the union and say start picking. Okay, let's get out of this and let's collapse it, editable poly. So now we have a bit of a mess here, as you can see. Pro Boolean always does this, but as you know, we can use turn to poly to already fix it marginally, I would say. It's already an improvement, so we're gonna collapse this turn to poly modifier. And now I wanna select this edge, grow the selection, and the reason for that is that now with this selection only here, let me just take off some of these polygons here. With this selection, we can then see what we're up to once we hide it. Or I should say, once we hide everything that's unselected. Hide unselected, and now we have a better view here on the area that we need to clean up. So let's start with some target welding here. We want to connect it here to these points that lead up there. That's pretty much the mission. And I'm gonna leave the horn as it is and try to connect it only here on these points that we had on the skull, or that we have on the skull. Because I want to leave the horn pretty much intact so that the low poly doesn't change. And on that ram head, it's not as much of a big deal as for this horn. So we're just gonna use target weld. Just gonna connect these points here. Sometimes you really have to zoom in all the way. For example, you see how here we have 2 points. So let's also target weld it. And then let's carry on here. Also connect these points. This point here, we can also target weld it. Same as this one. And this one, let's take it over here. And then this one we can connect here. And this one, let's just bring it up here. And now we have these points here. And I'm just gonna bring it up there. So let's get out of target weld and take these two vertex points and complete the connection here. And these two I also want to triangulate here. This one here, let's also tell it where the edge flow is supposed to be, and same as here. And here we have another one. Let's also connect it. And there's one more here. And then this one here, let's also connect it. And also here. So this is why I was hiding these polygons, because it's just easier to work on it. Let's go back to polygon and say unhide all. So for our later normal map bake, it would be best if these horns are separated objects. That's why I will go into our polygon mode here and make a selection here like that, and then grow the selection. And now we just got to do this individually here for these polygons all the way around, and then we can detach it. Let's say OK to that. So now if you compare it to what we had before, we don't have any zigzag lines there anymore because everything is perfectly welded. Let's take this piece here into our isolation view, and I want to cap it. And then in the polygon mode, I'm going to select this face here and inset it. Say OK to that and collapse it. So this way, when we have these horns there, you don't run into the chance that there might be some visible gap or anything, because it's perfectly closed geometry. So let's do some more optimizing, and I'm actually gonna hide our high poly so that we only have the low poly in the scene and we don't always have to jump in and out of the isolation view. And then let's start here with this one, ring selection and collapse. Gonna make use of our shortcuts here. This one here, I'm gonna just use Alt to not affect this edge that we have there, this pointy one, and then collapse the rest. And this one here, I'm just gonna do individually. Let's take a look. I mean, technically we could already unwrap it like that. All that we do now is just optimizing it. This one here will also save us quite a few polygons. But in that case, I'm only gonna affect this region here. So working in combination with Alt will help to not have the whole loop selected, but only the region that we want to affect. Just gonna take another look here. And now that I think about it, this might be a bit too high poly. So I'm gonna ring these two here and collapse it. And now one area that we haven't focused on too much yet is the back, where we have the sword head. We're gonna come to that, but I just see that this thing here needs a better alignment. And then these two we can also collapse. And now I think we should put some focus on these horns that we were just working on. So let's take it and see if there's anything that we can further optimize. And I think especially if we zoom in here at the top, I mean at the end of the horn, what I want to do is take every second edge here. Just gonna do that individually. and then ring it and essentially get rid of everything that's here at the back, and that leaves it only here with this selection. And here we have this quad selection. What I'm gonna do is deselect these ones here, press Alt to deselect, and now this selection here we can collapse, and that saves us also quite a few polys. Let me just undo that and check again. Yeah, that works. That does barely a change to our silhouette, but it saves us quite a few polys. So this is what optimization is all about here, what we're doing. And other than that, I think the silhouette should be left as it is, so we shouldn't be collapsing anything more there. So now that I look at this one here, I think we should add an extra edge here and there to make that a bit rounder. So I'm gonna go over here at this edge, use our move tool, and then connect it. This way this looks nicer there, and at the front it was a bit too hard edged before that. So let's take a look here at our handle. And what I want to do is take this edge loop here, and just now 3D Max is kind of loading here on me, and I'm gonna align these edges here on the Y axis, select them one by one, and this one here I'm just gonna control backspace, and that leaves us here pretty much with this selection here. So what I want to do here is select these edges individually and then align them on the Z axis. And in that case, I'm gonna bring our high poly back here on the display so that we see better where our geometry should be. Let's take this polygon here and push it out a bit on the x-axis, and I also want to align it here on the x. So this way we can then take this edge and also reposition it a bit, pull it back, and this part here can be pushed a bit to the side here. I'm actually gonna take these vertex points here, and then we can take that here more to the back. This here is the better way of doing it. And these vertex points, let's also position them so that this detail there stands out more on its own. So now let's take these points and just push them also more here to the center so that this detail, this ring that we have there, has the ideal retopo. I think that works pretty well. Just gonna push that back a bit here. And these points there on the top, we can drag them up a bit. And this here we can also refine a bit more. And that will result in a nice bake. Let's bring this one here up a bit more. And then this edge here, let's also pull it out a bit. And this one here as well, so that we have a bit more thickness there. This edge looks a little strange. I'm going to align it here on the x-axis as well, so that this is straight. And just to double check these edges here, let's also make them aligned here on x. And now we have this detail here optimized, and we will have a nice bake for it later once we get to the baking part. I'm just gonna take these vertex points here. I also want to align it here on the Y and just position it so that it is aligned there somewhat with the high poly. We might even unwrap this all as one piece later. We'll see once we get to the unwrapping part. But still, we want to make sure it's as much aligned as it can be here. I want to take this vertex point here and move it individually. Same for this one here. And I'm going to connect this here. So let's zoom back in here on this part here in the center. And I want to use our cut tool to add an extra edge here, so that we have it a bit more curved there, this element. And this one here, let's align it a bit. And then let's take these points here, these 3 points, and push it a bit here on the x-axis so that this is closer to the geometry as it was before. And now this point here, I'm going to connect it here with this one. I know it's sometimes hard to see with the high poly in the way, but it's always the next possible vertex point in general where it then makes sense to connect it. I'm going to collapse this loop here. So now it's time to focus here on that snake head where we haven't done anything so far, aside from assigning the colors here. And let's start here by looking at it from the top, where we also have some details that are kind of sticking out here. And let's reposition some of these vertex points here to follow more the flow. This vertex point here, let's bring it further down on the z-axis. And then on the x-axis, I'm gonna push it a bit more to the side towards our high poly. And these vertex points here, let's also move them and especially align them here on the z-axis, and these two here as well. And I'm gonna bring that further up here. So let's see what we do as the next thing, which is these points here. And pretty much just following this high poly detail there with the leather strap, in case we want to unwrap this as an individual UV island. But also in general, it's good to have the low poly edge flow following the high poly. So now what I want to do is select the inner part of the mouth and also assign a color to it, which then makes it easier for us to see what we're working on. Let's also select these upper polygons here. Just gonna take a look at it here from the front. This one here, we can already see that Z-Remesher didn't really follow the flow there. So let's connect it here with an extra edge. And now with this selection here, we have pretty much the inner mouth. I'm gonna add this polygon here, and then with the vertex mode, make a connection over here. Back to our polygon mode, and this way now we have pretty much the area that we can give a new color to, or not a new color, but a different color. Oh, and in that case, I actually want to give it the blue. So as a next thing, let's select our low poly, which we already have selected, by the way, but add our high poly tooth as well as this high poly part to it, so that we have 3 objects here selected, and we have it pretty much isolated without the sphere, so that we see better what we're doing. And I'm actually gonna make the sword transparent so that we see the wireframe better here on our low poly. And now let's just start optimizing some of these edges here. Let's ring it and then collapse. And here, this one too. Ring and collapse. And just start optimizing here. And just another one of these loading phases here. Don't know if you also get that, or if it's just my computer being slow. So these edges here, I'm just gonna collapse them, but leave them there on the top part. That's where I used Alt. And here, Control Backspace. And this here, we can also Control Backspace. And then this one I'm gonna collapse. And here we can use target weld to connect it here to that side. That way we already saved a significant amount of polys there. And here it looks like we can also collapse some edges. Just gonna select them individually. I don't want to take too much away. I still want this snake head to be pretty organic looking and not too hard edged. And let me take a look here at the side. And let's see if we can move these vertex points in a better direction here. On the Z-axis, I'm gonna push it up so that our high poly there in the background, where the mouth starts, or I should say the inner mouth, is as much aligned as it can be here with the blue parts on our low poly. Just gonna use target weld here. And this one I'm also just gonna target weld down there. And let me just zoom back in. And I'm also gonna target weld over here, and then let's take a look at this point here. Actually, this point here, and also reposition it a bit. And yeah, I'm in edge constraint mode, so that we don't change the position, but only move it here on the edges. Basically for a better edge flow. And let me take these 3 and also shift it up with edge constraint on. And let's see about it here at the bottom. This is actually looking pretty good there. So let's go back here to our edge mode and select a few individual edges. Still quite high poly there, so I'm gonna collapse these. And let's take a look here. This one, I think I'm gonna delete the one under it here. Control backspace. And this one here, I'm gonna move it with our edge constraint on so that it's a bit rounder there. Because this one we're gonna unwrap individually later as a UV island. So it's just good to have it follow the overall shape as much as it can. Gonna add some extra edges here on these parts and push it out further, because this is the nose of the snake and this should be rounder as it was before. So that's why an extra edge loop is okay there. And this one here, I want to delete this polygon there, then select this edge and then use our little arrow button here once again, once 3D Max is done loading, and center it here to 0 on X. And back to target welding. Let's see if there's something else that needs some target welding. I'm just gonna jump back here into our edge mode, make another ring selection here, deselect these 4 edges, and then down here I'm just gonna collapse it. I think that will also save us some poly count, some polys that we actually don't need. Let's see about this one here. This might also be okay to collapse. And now that resulted in a bit of a mess down here. I'm just going to connect that so that we have a better flow there. And here, this one, I'm just going to delete with backspace and then connect these points here. And push that out a bit, or actually I'm gonna target weld it over here to the left. This one here we can also target weld. And yeah, I keep having these little stutters in 3D Max. I wonder if I'm the only one. And a bit more target welding here as well. But now that I think about it, I think I have this also on my other computer. I have 2 PCs with 3D Max on it, and I think it does it on both. These tiny stutters. But I guess it's just because we have a very poly heavy scene here with our high poly in it. Let me take another look at it here from the top, as well as from the side. And now I want to make a quick stop here at our actual Retopo tools. I'm gonna press this tiny little arrow button here so that it pops up entirely. Then go over here to Freeform and say Draw on Surface and pick our high poly. So now we have it selected. You can see it shows up there where it says Surface or under it, and now we go over here to optimize and press Ctrl, Shift and Alt, which then enables us to move these vertex points around, but they will stick onto the high poly. We can also define a distance if we want. Right now the offset is at 0, and essentially I want to move these vertex points here on this bevel that we have where the tooth is coming out of on the high poly. That was a bit hard to do without the Retopo tool, so that's why we're switching here into the Retopo Optimize. And I'm just gonna right click here in the viewport, jump out of the Retopo mode so that we have our base tools, and I want to cut in some extra edges here, connect it here, get out of the cut tool, go back into optimize, And then we have a bit more geometry here that we can work with to reposition that. And also here. Always important to look at it here from different angles. Let's connect some of these vertex points here with an edge. And we can do that by pressing Ctrl and then just dragging the mouse from one vertex point to the other. That will create an edge in between them. So now I want to go over here to our cut tool. And I want to add some extra edges here, because I think we have a bit too much of a gap there when I look at that in transparency mode. And now we have some extra vertex points here to make this mouth look more impressive where this tooth comes out. And this will overall here add to the nice look of the low poly. Here I'm gonna make another one of these edge connections by pressing Ctrl and dragging. And now we also had a quick look here pretty much at this Retopo tool. The Retopo tool also has a whole bunch of other functions. We could have just made the whole sword with it really, but I think it was the right thing to show you here the Z remesher and how we get a low poly out of it. So I'm just gonna use Ctrl here and also drag another edge from vertex to vertex, same as here. And then we can move that around here. Once again, Ctrl, Alt, and Shift will do that. And here, let's connect this as well. And just do some more optimizing here pretty much. If you press Shift on a vertex and drag it to the direction of another vertex, it will basically do a target weld. So this is another way that we can work by just having this optimize mode on here. And let's see if we have some other areas where we can also target weld. Like here. Remember pressing Shift and now Ctrl, Shift, and Alt to reposition some of these vertex points here. And like the name suggests, we are in the Optimize tool, and I'm just gonna press Shift here to target weld a few more of these points and then reposition some of these vertex points as well. And here I'm also just gonna use Shift to snap that into place. And this one here we can also target weld. And what else can we do here on the snake? I think this is looking pretty good. Let's see what we can do with this optimize tool here on that part. And I'm gonna use Ctrl, Alt, and Shift to reposition that a bit more here. We could have used that before, but the point was to get it as optimized as possible before we come in here, and this is just the finishing touches pretty much here. These tools that we are using here and the shortcuts for them, you can see them if you press Ctrl and hover over these buttons here. Then you can take a screenshot and really learn it. But for now we are done here with the optimizing. And now we still have the tooth and that sphere that we need to optimize. So let's select our low poly tooth here, and we have all 4 of them. And right now they are pretty high here on our poly count. 1,400 polys just for these small tooth. So let's go over here and affect pivot only. And let's center it here. 0, 0, and 0. And then we can individually here on the y-axis position it in the center. So basically x and z needs to be at 0, and y we can individually move. And now let's optimize this here some more. First of all, we will never see the top part here. So let's select these polygons there. Grow the selection. And let's just make sure we really don't see them. If I grow it once more, it gets visible there, so I'm going to shrink it. But this part here, we can then delete. And here at the bottom, we have a bit of a mess. So I'm just going to delete this whole cap there. And also I'm going to delete these tooth here, because we just need to focus on this one and then we copy it over. So similar to what we were doing earlier with the horn, I'm gonna select every second edge here and then make a ring selection. And in that case, I'm gonna just collapse it for all of them. Let's grab this here with the border mode and then pressing Shift, dragging it down and collapsing it will give us this here. I'm just gonna make a connection here on that and scale it out a bit. And let's just be very precise here with this vertex point at the bottom. And I'm gonna push it here so that it's perfectly aligned with the high poly. And now back into the isolation view here. We can then use our symmetry modifier on the x-axis and another one on the z-axis, and now we brought it already down quite significantly here to 500, but let's optimize it some more. I'm going to collapse this edge loop here, and this one here we can also collapse. So now we have it at 360. And that might still be pretty high, but I would say we're just gonna keep it like this. And let's go over here to that sphere. So first of all, I'm gonna go over here to our high poly and effect pivot once again. And let's zero it out, and then same thing as before, let's just place it here on the y-axis just so that we have it there in place. And the same thing here for our low poly, 0, 0, 0, and now 3D Max is loading on me again. And then on the y-axis we just push it there somewhere into the center. So it was a mistake earlier that I was cutting that in half. So I'm gonna just use symmetry modifier on the z-axis, and you will see that it looks messed up. That's because we have the welding on. If we uncheck that, it will become all nice, as you can see. This is exactly what it looked like when we also had it in ZBrush earlier, when we exported it. So now let's take this sphere here, the low poly one, and I want to be in isolation mode. And these edges here, I don't like how they are so zigzaggy. I'm going to take it into edge constraint mode and then align it here on the x-axis. I always like to keep those edges straight, unless they need to have some sort of a different path, then of course it's okay. So now let's go over here to polygon mode and delete the other half. We're just gonna use symmetry later to put it back in place. And I'm gonna select every second edge here, ring it and collapse it. So now we have quite a few polys here, and I'm gonna also select every second one here for these three. Gonna select it individually and also collapse it. And let's go over here to our target weld and optimize it a bit further. Same here. So now that we have this also optimized here, let's go out of our vertex mode and put the symmetry modifier back on. I'm gonna flip it on the x-axis, and let's also put the symmetry modifier back on our other low poly parts. For that, I'm gonna hide the high poly so that we only see our low poly here. Symmetry on the x-axis, and I want to flip it. And here on the z-axis, in that case we don't need to flip it. And here we have this horn. Remember, we put the pivots in place earlier for all these things, so now all we have to do is use the symmetry. And in that case I want to have the weld seams on. So as you can see, we brought it down quite a bit, 11,300 polys. Before that we had something like 15,000 something when we started doing the real optimization. So that was definitely successful. What I want to do now is prepare it for the unwrapping. So I'm just going to delete the symmetry modifier on those parts that we only need to unwrap once. And here on this leather band, let's collapse the whole symmetry modifier stack for it. Right click and collapse all. And then let's go over here to front view, go in the vertex mode and delete the half at the bottom, because we're only gonna unwrap the top part. And the same here. We disable the symmetry modifier for the bottom part. And this here is what we're going to unwrap.